Bonjour à vous toutes et à vous tous. Cher Monsieur Abi-Saab, bienvenue chez vous, ici, à l'Institut. Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, bienvenue à toutes et à tous à la Maison de la Paix pour cet événement en l'honneur du professeur Abi-Saab à l'occasion de son 90e anniversaire. C'est tellement plus joli 90e que 90e, je dois dire, en tant que Française. Comme vous le saviez toutes et tous, comme vous le savez toutes et tous, l'Institut a une longue, dense et riche histoire. Et dans quelques années, nous célébrerons notre 100e anniversaire. Nous commençons d'ores et déjà un travail de mémoire qui est sans doute la manière la plus puissante, la plus intéressante pour nous de célébrer ce siècle. Lorsqu'on se penche sur les 100 dernières années dans une perspective multilatérale et de gouvernance internationale, l'Institut a joué un rôle clé. Un rôle clé de par les idées qui ont été produites, nourries, développées ici et qui ont ensuite essaimé, non seulement dans notre monde académique, mais aussi dans le monde de la pratique internationale et multilatérale. Un rôle clé aussi de par les femmes et les hommes qui ont incarné au fil des années notre ou devrais-je plutôt dire en fait nos deux instituts, HEI et l'IUED. Les grands directeurs, bien sûr, et jusqu'à aujourd'hui, c'était des directeurs uniquement, donc j'utilise le terme comme ça. Bien sûr, qui ont créé, développé, solidifié, y compris très matériellement, comme ces dernières années, notre magnifique maison, ce bâtiment extraordinaire dans lequel on se trouve aujourd'hui. Mais aussi, évidemment, les professeurs, les étudiantes et les étudiants qui deviennent immanquablement des alumni. Et parfois, d'ailleurs, nos étudiants qui sont devenus des alumni deviennent aussi, plus tard, des professeurs qui marquent alors fortement l'Institut et des générations d'étudiantes et d'étudiants, mais aussi la pensée et l'action internationale et multilatérale. Et c'est votre cas, cher professeur Abi-Saab. Non seulement vous êtes évidemment un ancien professeur, mais vous êtes aussi un alumnus de cet institut. Lorsque vous avez soutenu votre thèse en 1967, vous enseignez déjà, si je ne me trompe pas, à l'Institut en tant qu'assistant, j'imagine, et vous êtes resté l'un des piliers du département de droit international de l'Institut et de son rayonnement international jusqu'en 2000. Le travail de mémoire que nous avons engagé à l'Institut en vue de notre 100e anniversaire ne se veut pas simplement comme une célébration du passé, mais bien comme une mise en exergue de l'énergie créative et pionnière de notre Institut sur presque 100 années. Une énergie à partir de laquelle nous construisons aujourd'hui le projet de demain. Dans ce travail de mémoire, nous souhaitons mettre en avant la pertinence profondément réaffirmée aujourd'hui de tout le travail qui a été fait pendant des décennies par les femmes et les hommes qui ont donc incarné cet institut. Comprendre notre histoire pour ancrer notre action présente et notre projection future dans un terreau dont nous tirons notre force et aussi notre fierté, mais qui est aussi suffisamment malléable pour s'adapter aux transformations importantes du monde dans lequel nous sommes aujourd'hui. L'un des projets que nous avons lancés en vue de notre centenaire est celui d'une série de portraits. 100 dans un premier temps, mais nous irons sans doute au-delà. Votre portrait, cher professeur Abi-Saab, a fait partie, bien évidemment, de la première série de 15 que nous avons dévoilée en septembre dernier. Je ne pense pas que vous l'ayez vu, et c'est un honneur pour moi de vous le révéler aujourd'hui en direct. Alors, je ne sais pas si je vais... C'est très facile à faire. Essayez. Donc, nous le positionnerons très rapidement à la sortie de l'amphithéâtre ici, comme ça vous aurez tous et toute l'occasion, si vous le souhaitez, de le regarder et de le lire plus en détail. Cher professeur Abi-Saab, depuis mon arrivée en tant que directrice à l'Institut en septembre 2020, je souhaitais vous rencontrer. J'avais tellement entendu parler de vous. Le Covid, il faut bien le dire, a représenté un obstacle, c'est certain. Et je me réjouis donc vraiment aujourd'hui d'avoir la chance de vous rencontrer pour la première fois et j'espère vraiment que ce n'est pas la dernière, certainement pas. J'ai déjà des projets. J'avais tellement entendu parler de vous, disais-je, évidemment, j'aurais dû préciser, toujours dans les termes les plus élogieux. Mais je vais laisser ici vos anciens étudiants et collègues vous rendre ces hommages directement. Je ne vais pas non plus m'essayer à résumer votre longue carrière. Vos collègues et vos anciens étudiants sont là aussi beaucoup plus à même de faire cela, beaucoup mieux que moi. Je me contenterai ici simplement de souligner quelques termes clés qui vous sont associés et qui caractérisent le message que vous avez porté et que vous portez toujours aujourd'hui. Et vous verrez que les mots parlent d'eux-mêmes. un internationalisme progressiste, une conception située et donc historique forcément du droit. Le droit international comme droit vivant, complexe, fluide et parfois contradictoire. Un nouvel ordre économique mondial à encadrer par les normes et les principes d'un droit international à construire pour ce faire, rapport pour l'ONU en 1984. Justice sociale, avec un petit clin d'œil, une petite parenthèse ici pour mentionner que juste à côté, la conférence internationale du travail qui se tient dans les jours, cette semaine et la semaine suivante, va faire l'objet d'une annonce par l'Organisation internationale du travail de la création d'une coalition mondiale pour la justice sociale. Droit humanitaire international, intérêt collectif, coopération et communauté, Third World Perspective on Internationalization Law, le droit international et sa nécessaire contextualisation critique, une approche critique certes, mais une approche critique profondément constructive. Les mots parlent d'eux-mêmes, disais-je, et ce que ces mots montrent, c'est bien la modernité et la pertinence toujours très évidente de vos travaux et de votre pensée. Ce que les mots montrent aussi, c'est la cohérence de ces travaux et de votre pensée avec le projet de l'Institut tel que notre communauté l'a redéfini depuis ces 2 dernières années et le porte et le déploie aujourd'hui. Avec l'affirmation que nous avons faite dans ces 2 dernières années d'une boussole à 3 dimensions, paix, bien sûr, mais aussi durabilité et équité et justice. Avec la conviction toujours plus ferme et réaffirmée que nous portons de l'importance de la collaboration et de la coopération internationale, et évidemment du droit international comme une colonne vertébrale majeure de cette collaboration. Mais bien sûr un droit flexible et sans doute à réinventer pour s'adapter au contexte géopolitique, social et écologique de notre monde, et peut-être surtout et avant tout pour assurer la nécessaire promesse d'une inclusivité plus grande qui est aujourd'hui loin d'être probablement suffisante. Cher professeur Abi-Saab, je me réjouis vraiment beaucoup d'écouter les hommages mérités qui vont vous être rendus, de vous écouter aussi tout à l'heure. Et encore une fois, je vous redis ici, bienvenue chez vous. Vous nous faites un grand honneur. Et j'aurais dû ajouter que je cède la parole au professeur Andrew Clapham. Alors, oui, je vais peut-être sortir d'abord.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the International Law Department of the Geneva Graduate Institute. This is, of course, a wonderful occasion, a great birthday celebration. It will be hard for me to say things about Professor Abi-Saab that you don't think you already know, because everybody considers that they know him better than everybody else knows him. If I tell somebody that I meet around the world that I know Georges Abi-Saab, they will tell me that they know him better than I do. Georges is not somebody that you know about, it's somebody that you think you actually know. One of the things that some of us know about Professor Abi-Saab is that he only celebrates his birthday every 5 years. And as he was born in 1933, that means that today is actually his 18th birthday. It's an 18th birthday party. Young Georges, this is your coming of age party. Now you will be hearing a lot from the distinguished guests and friends of his, colleagues and former students. And you have just heard from the director something about Professor Abi-Saab. This is not the time to sort of do the whole CV and so on. You're going to be getting some real insights, but just in case, member of the Institut de droit international, judge ad hoc at the International Court of Justice, and I think you'll be hearing more about that later, judge in the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and that's the picture that you see on the portrait that you were just shown, member of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization and a member of a WTO panel, including one I myself have been recently studying, Ukraine against Russia, arbitrator, consultant to the Secretary General of the United Nations, member of the Egyptian delegation to several international conferences, in particular the Diplomatic Conference on the Reaffirmation and Development of International Humanitarian Law, which gave us the 2 additional protocols of 1977, And I know that some of my colleagues have been recently reading the travaux of that work and have been reminding me what a crucial role Professor Abi-Saab played with his arguments and his advocacy during that conference. International advocate and counsel before the International Court of Justice and multiple other instances. And all of this will be touched on by the guests, so I'm not going to say too much because I don't want to steal their thunder. Let me say a little about the guests because you don't have a program in front of you. In the order in which they will speak, we have Dr. Danny Warner, Swiss-American political scientist and former deputy to the director here at the Graduate Institute, gained his PhD here at the Institute, and has known Professor Abi-Saab since he was a student here. He writes a weekly column in Counterpunch, which I can highly recommend. Then we will have Professor Philip Alston, who's come all the way from New York University Law School. He's had multiple roles at the United Nations, particularly in human rights, chair of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee, special rapporteur on summary arbitrary executions, special rapporteur on extreme poverty, member of the Commission of Inquiry on Central African Republic. I could go on. Multiple books, all highly recommended. And then we will hear from Professor Richard Falk, contemporary of Georges Abi-Saab, emeritus professor of international law at Princeton University, prolific author of books related to international law and international relations, all of which are highly recommended, and UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. Then there will be a coffee break, and after the break there will be a new panel which will include Judge Yusuf from Somalia, judge at the International Court of Justice, recently its president. Most important in the current context is where he did his graduate law studies. Yes, that's the University of Florence in Italy, but of course then at the Graduate Institute where he took his PhD. From 1975 to 1980, Dr. Yusuf served as Somalia's delegate to the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea and legal advisor later and director of the Office of International Standards and Legal Affairs at UNESCO. He is also a member of the Institut de droit international. And then we will hear from Professor Laurence Boisson de Chazorn, another former student of Professor Abi-Saab's, now Professor of International Law at the University of Geneva, and this year, La Chaire Annuelle Avenir Commun Durable at the Collège de France in Paris. I was recently in Paris and I saw people queuing up and I thought there was interesting sold, but in fact it was to get tickets for Laurence Boisson de Chazorn's conference. You can get the inaugural lesson in all good bookshops. It's called Law en droit international entre singularité et pluralité. And Professor Boisson de Chazorn is currently appearing in several cases before the International Court of Justice. He's a judge at the Administrative Tribunal for the Bank of International Settlements and a member of the Institut de droit international. And lastly, you will hear from our host, Professor Marcelo Cohen, until recently a professor here of international law at the Graduate Institute. He's the Secretary General of the Institut de droit international, counsel before the International Court of Justice, and of course, former student of Professor Abi-Saab. So, back to the birthday boy. I took a quick look at the topics that are coming up, and I did not notice a specific topic on Professor Abi-Saab as a teacher. And I know that mentor is coming, but that's not quite the same as teacher. And friends, I have a confession. I asked artificial intelligence to write something on Georges Abi-Saab as a teacher, because I figured that would be able to trawl through all the student evaluations over the last 50 years, and we will see what it came up with. This is what came back. Georges Abi-Saab is widely regarded as an exceptional teacher with several outstanding qualities that contribute to his effectiveness in the classroom. Here are some of the notable qualities. Number one, expertise and knowledge. Georges Abi-Saab possesses a deep understanding and knowledge of the subject matter he teaches. He has dedicated significant time and effort to master his field, which allows him to provide accurate and up-to-date information to his students. Passionate and engaging. One of Georges Abi-Saab's most noticeable qualities is his passion for teaching. He genuinely enjoys sharing his knowledge and interacting with his students. His enthusiasm is infectious and helps create an engaging and dynamic learning environment. Clear communication. Georges Abi-Saab excels in explaining complex concepts in a clear and concise manner. He understands the importance of effective communication and uses various techniques, such as analogies, visual aids, and real-life examples that ensure that his students grasp difficult ideas easily. Approachability. Students find George Abi-Saab approachable and friendly, creating a supportive atmosphere in the classroom. He encourages open dialogue, welcomes questions, and actively listens to his students' concerns. This accessibility fosters a comfortable learning environment where students feel comfy, seeking help or sharing their thoughts. Empathy and understanding. George Abi-Saab is known for his empathy and understanding towards his students' individual needs. He recognizes that every student has unique strengths, weaknesses, and learning styles. He adapts his teaching methods to accommodate these difficulties and differences, providing personalized support to help each student reach their full potential. High expectations. While being empathetic, George Abi-Saab also sets high expectations for his students. He challenges them to strive for excellence and pushes them to surpass their own limits. This motivates students to work hard and develop a strong work ethic. Mentorship and guidance. George Abi-Saab goes beyond being a teacher and acts as a mentor to his students. He offers guidance, career advice, and encourages them to explore their interests and passion. He takes a genuine interest in their overall development and success, both academically and personally. And lastly, continuous improvement. George Abi-Saab is committed to his own professional growth and continuously seeks ways to enhance his teaching methods. He stays updated with the latest research and educational practices, incorporating innovative approaches in his teaching. He welcomes feedback from his students and colleagues to refine his techniques further. Well, George, happy birthday from me, and happy birthday from ChatGPT. Philip, why don't you come and sit? I'll let you come back. Why don't you come down? Please, Danny.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank the Institute and thank Marcelo for giving us this opportunity for this celebration. As the only non-lawyer speaking, I'm slightly intimidated, but it perhaps is an example of the breadth and depth of George Abi-Saab's teaching that a non-lawyer is here to speak on his behalf. In a speech at a recent conference in Montreal of the International Studies Association, where George Abi-Saab was honored, he talked about the concept of haphazardness, and he gave several examples in his life of how his own career had been haphazard, beginning by studying economics and then becoming a lawyer and a law student. His description of haphazardness encourages me to give some personal anecdotes and recount some of the things that happened to us together in almost 4 decades. I leave it to the distinguished professors of international law to fill in the legal and judicial aspects of his career. Today I speak as a non-lawyer and someone who has always been enormously honored when George Abi-Saab introduces me as one of his children. So I will speak not only of an intellectual mentor, but I will speak someone as an intellectual father and much more. As a political science student here at the Graduate Institute, and I mention a mature student, I was not the age of the other students when I was here, I took the required international law class for 1 semester with Professor Abi-Saab. I was not a very good student. My own undergraduate career had been in philosophy, And on my papers and exams, he wrote, "This is interesting philosophically, but it's not law." Having finished the required courses, I decided that I would write a thesis on the subject we're talking now, that I graduated undergraduate in 1968, and I wanted to write something on ethics and morality. At the time, the only course I could find in the world was Stanley Hoffman teaching Moral Reasoning 28 at Harvard. And I proposed to do a thesis here at the Graduate Institute in ethics or morality. The entire political science section refused the subject. They said it was not an academic subject. There were problems. So what I went to do in desperation, I went to see Professor Abi-Saab, remembering that I had not been a distinguished student. And I said, "Professor Abi-Saab, I would like to do a thesis on morality or ethics, and the members of the political science section don't want me to do it or will not be my advisor. Can I work with you?" We had very few relationships at that time. And again, I was not a distinguished student. He could have turned me down easily. There was a problem administratively. You can't have someone in the political science department having an advisor in the law section. And he turned to me and said, "Write me something." And I didn't really know what I wanted to say at the time, but I turned out about 20 pages of a very, very, very rough draft. And I gave it to him. And I said to myself, this is going to be the yes or no. If he says no, my studies are over. And I waited. I waited. George doesn't read that quickly, certain things. I think that's fair. And we had a meeting, and he looked me straight in the eye. We're talking here 1988, and I can see it now. And he said, "Danny, I think you might have something to say." I think you might have something to say. He could have turned me down, either administratively or on the basis of what I wrote, but he didn't. And I became a student of his. In our decades of relationship, he has remained enormously patient with me, generous, even more generous than my biological father. I've never been criticized. I've never been told this is not worth reading, which many of my professors at Amherst did, and my father certainly did frequently. Everything I have written, books, articles, that have anything to do with law, he has had the patience to read them. I go out to Clarence, and he makes corrections and suggestions. And every once in a while, I get excited about a subject. I said, this is something new, remembering that my background was not in law or in international relations. And he would look at me with this smile, not condescending, but he would say, you know, Danny, I've written books on that. And I still don't know the depth and width of his knowledge, because every time I think I find something of interest and new, it turns out that he's studied it or written about it. Now, not only has George Abi-Saab been an intellectual mentor to me, but he also once saved my job. and those of you from Egypt will be particularly interested in the story. Early on, I worked as a journalist for the Associated Press. And at the time I was working, there was the judicial discussion of the Taba case, which I'm sure most of you remember. And when the decision was made, there was a great deal of interest in Washington, in Tel Aviv. I was on the phone with Tel Aviv, Washington, New York, and all the other journalists who were there, UPI, New York Times, Reuters, they all filed, and the Associated Press didn't file. And the calls were coming in. Where is the person in the town hall? What happened? There were no telephones like that at the time, and I kept saying, I don't know where she is. And my dear friend Brenda, my colleague, came in about 2 hours later in tears. And she said, I don't understand the decision. There was some buoy somewhere out in the water. Professor Kaplich, it was buoy number 9, as I remember, something about the law of the sea. And Brenda was crying, and I'm saying, you're fired, I'm fired, we haven't done our job. And in desperation, I said, I think I have a solution. And I picked up the phone, and I dialed Claron. And I said, Professor Abi-Saab, this is Danny Warner from the Associated Press. We have to write an article about the Taba case. Au secours. General public, no footnotes, explain it to everyone. And in half an hour, he explained succinctly and clearly exactly what had happened. And 4 hours after the decision, AP filed. And the next day, because there's a scorecard, everywhere in the world, the front page on Taba was the Associated Press article. And the other journalists from Reuters, AFP, would come in the office and say, we didn't understand a thing. How did you get that information? I didn't say we got it from the horse's mouth, but it wasn't far. So not only does George have the capacity to explain difficult legal things, but he also had the capacity and has the capacity to explain things to the general public, which is enormous. He has been a role model for so many years to so many people, many of whom didn't study with him directly, but read what he did. I think of the look on my friend in India, who Dick Falk knows well, B.S. Chimney, when Chimney came to the Institute and saw George Abi-Saab. It was in awe of Professor Abi-Saab. And for those who have had the privilege of studying under him, especially those who he considers to be his children, he has been more than just a role model. Our beloved friend who passed away, Virginia Leary, used to turn to me and say, Danny, why do we love George so much? George Abi-Saab has been more than an intellectual mentor. That's the title I gave Andrew, but it's more than that. He has always been a shining intellect, full of curiosity and seemingly boundless in knowledge. One of the great memories I have of him is when the eminent jurist Paul Reuter came to the Graduate Institute for a seminar. Peter, you were there. And I remember Professor Abi-Saab taking notes for what Mr. Reuter was saying. Peter was doing the same, as if they were students years before, as if the level of curiosity and interest had never gone away. Beyond the intellectual mentor and eminent jurist, most personally, I leave George. I've tried to say thank you, but I'm going to use a word that he used with me, which and I think some people in the room, I know Marcelo, consider to be the highest. George, you are a true mensch. It is difficult for me publicly to thank you. I hope I have not been too personal. I have tried my best to say thank you. Happy birthday, George.
Well, I'm not going to tell you about my relationship with my father, but apart from that, I've only known Georges for half of his life. 45 years ago, I think we met, and he was never my teacher, although I have to say that he's actually always been my teacher. I thank God, I suppose, that I never went through what Danny did, in the sense of never having to submit any manuscript of any sort to Georges or endure his judgment. But he's always been an absolutely wonderful mentor to me as well. I thought in making a few remarks this afternoon, I would focus on the man himself rather than on his many accomplishments and positions and so on. This comes partly from a sort of informal oral history project that Georges and I have been engaging in for the last couple of years. Along with Jan Henrik Hinselmann, who is hiding in the back row up there. We've had a lot of very intensive one-on-one exchanges. I haven't added up the hours, but I do have in my bag down there, which Georges hasn't seen yet, a 300-page manuscript, single-spaced, of the discussions that we've been having. And I wanted to try to just distill some thoughts out of all those exchanges about Georges as a person. I risk getting very much out of my depth through a very amateurish approach to psychology here, but I've long thought, and my exchanges with Georges have really confirmed this sense that all of us have a certain character, personality, however one describes it, that actually influence dramatically the paths that we take, the choices that we make, and what we do with the opportunities we have in life. Of course, we're all shaped by a range of different factors, whether it's family, whether it's culture, whether it's particular experiences, setbacks, or whatever. But the point is, I think that when we actually arrive at the door of what will become our life's profession, we are already very much shaped, and one could predict in advance a fair amount about what we're going to do and how we do it. And so I want to reflect very briefly on how I see Georges in that sense. The first point is simply that of values. There's a lot of talk, a lot of loose talk about values. in the world, but Georges is deeply driven and motivated by both personal and political values. And from what I can see, they have remained remarkably steady. His commitment to social justice, to calling out injustices, his belief in equality, which manifests itself in many ways, and I'm not going to go through his politics and so on, but it is a theme that is absolutely constant. Another is respect for others. It's a deep respect, which is, in my experience, almost without equal. I know that I don't have that respect for others. I wish I did. No, I mean that in all seriousness, in the sense that for most of my life I've been able to look at other people and say, you don't understand anything. You're not very smart, you whatever. That's been my instinctive response all too often. Georges, I'm sure because he's human, he will occasionally do that. But for the most part, that's not how he engages. So you can imagine, I don't know, I shouldn't even think of the prospect, but an engagement between Georges and Donald Trump. But in all seriousness, it would be on the basis of beliefs and values. Can you tell me more about why you think that? Instead of saying, you're expletive. But he applies that to everyone. There is a genuine engagement with their thinking, with their views. And the way he expresses it is that he wants to speak their language. He wants to learn their language and be able to talk to them in their terms. There's also, and I think this is part of the respect, there's a modesty about Georges. And again, I'm not saying this in a silly way. He's not modest. He is as vain as the rest of us at a certain level. But he is compulsively non-self-promoting in a genuine way. It's not from insecurity, it's not from a lack of conviction or strength. It's just a sense that, I am an equal, but I'm not better than you or than others. And I think that modesty comes through many times, and it probably explains a lot of what he's actually achieved, in the sense that people haven't felt threatened by Georges, because you don't get into confrontations with him. It's going to be a patient, careful exchange, no matter what the differences are. There's a belief in the power of ideas, and this certainly comes through in the oral history discussions that we've had. An almost naive belief, I suppose one might say, in some ways, because he really thinks that if you think something through, and if you then explain it, it's going to prevail in a certain way. And of course, that is a wonderful characteristic, in fact. Linked to that is the pedagogue, which I think is also part of his character. We tend to say about someone, oh, she's a great pedagogue or whatever, and you think, oh yeah, she enjoys teaching and she's entertaining to listen to and she conveys the sense fairly simply. But that's not what I mean by Georges. Georges is always not teaching others because that's too hierarchical, but everything in life is, let me explain to you, not the basics or whatever, but why and how. the coffee comes to taste as it is. It doesn't matter what the subject is. There is a real need and desire to explain to you. And of course, as Danny said, it's always done with immense clarity, and you always come away much the wiser for it. Just two other elements to identify. One, I used this term when I engaged with George when he was given the Manly Hudson Medal at the American Society of International Law, and I called him a wordsmith. And I think he was, I'm not sure if he'd heard the term before, but he has mentioned it a number of times. But again, I have, and particularly in the United States, I shouldn't be racist here, but I will be, I have a number of American colleagues, particularly academics, who really do speak in paragraphs, as we say. It just sort of, the mouth opens and pages pour out uninterrupted. Richard, I know you won't do that, but the difference with George, and I asked him at one stage how quickly he spoke in Arabic, because in both English and French, he speaks quite slowly. But what you can hear is every word being chosen. There are no just automatic phrases. The words are sort of pieced together by an artisan, and the result is often much more evocative, even than a native speaker, because the native speaker doesn't tend to think so carefully about the choice of words, but he does. And finally, as a critic, George is, I mean, there are a lot of people who are a complete pain in the neck, because no matter what you say, I won't mention my 19-year-old son here, but the response will be, no, you're wrong, I don't agree with that, etc. George rarely sort of takes anything at face value. So no matter how straightforward or simple the statement that you make, what you're going to get from George is not presented as a correction or an amendment or telling you that you're wrong, but he's going to say something like, yes, that's true, but, and then you'll get an elaboration, a refinement, and so on, which is the critic always coming out. It's the way he thinks. He just doesn't accept any proposition at face value without probing deeply into its accuracy. I think these are some of the traits that explain why he has accomplished as much as he has. They probably also explain why he has not gone down certain paths and done things that some of us might have wished he had. And by that I mean, I think that it is important for one to promote one's ideas, to be an advocate for the causes or whatever that you believe in. That's not George. Again, but I've done my work, I've reflected deeply on this, here is my analysis, and it should speak for itself. But I'm not going to step in and be, self-promoting in this context. I'll finish with one just very short anecdote, but it builds on what Danny was saying before. During the oral history, in fact, it was in a conversation, just a conversation between the two of us on the phone, but I said, so next week we'll do the diplomatic conference of the early 1970s. And he said, yes, I mean, that was one of the great moments. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, in a funny sort of way, I wouldn't say this to anyone else, but I was, pretty central to the outcome of that conference. But of course, we can't talk about that. And So Jan, who has done absolutely superb research by way of background for all of our conversations, came up with at least 3 different accounts, detailed academic analyses of the conference, each of which said, and the key player in all of this was this silly Egyptian man. And so, of course, I went back and reported that and said, Georges, you can be a little more forthcoming here. And he said, oh, that's lovely to hear. All right, well, I'll speak a little more assertively about what happened during the conference. But it really was a classic example of the modesty, but of the confirmation from those who are now pouring through the travaux préparatoires, the background works and so on, of how influential Georges, in his quiet, determined, legal, analytical way, has been, and the impact that he's had on so many of the areas in which he's worked. So just to say, Georges, it's been a huge privilege to know you, and you have enriched my life greatly. And may there be many more years ahead. Thank you.
It's a very happy occasion for me to have this opportunity to celebrate George's birthday and more enduringly his extraordinary life. When I heard Andrew in his introductory remarks say that everyone thinks they know George better than he, I was thinking my only real credential is that I've known him longer than anyone. And I think that's probably something that has given me at least this sense of a life that has evolved in such a impressively principled manner, principled in his beliefs, in his dedication to superior work, and to his commitment to a more just world. Those who have preceded me in this panel said some of the things that I had thought of saying, and since they've said them better than I won't try to repeat them. But I would say that even GPT chat was a hard act to follow. And it's interesting how in that cyber world, one penetrates in such a way as to create a realistic profile that exceeds the knowledge of most ordinary human beings. As both Danny and Philip have emphasized, I also wanted to say something about the personal side of George's jurisprudence and his particularly looked at from an American law perspective, his identity as a jurist. We don't have jurists in America. We have sort of law people and people that do sociology of law or look at law from a political perspective. But George, for me, was the first person I knew who firmly existentially believed in the autonomy of law as a way of achieving a disciplined understanding of what existed, and by contrast, what was important to struggle to make existing. In other words, he didn't collapse, as many American legal scholars do, the subjectivities of context or what they desire the law to be. He had a kind of integrity that is very rare in the American context, and really differentiates American approaches to international law from the great tradition of European legal thinking. And it's in that great tradition, you have both the Grotian and the Kelsen approaches, and I would put George, he may object to this, but I would put him in the line of Kelsenite thinking, because the Grotian line tried to incorporate natural law into the body of how we should think and determine the role of law in human experience. I wanted to say I've been blessed by knowing two exceptional Egyptian scholars who were close friends, George being one and Edward Said being the other. And they have an amazing quality of similarity and dissimilarity in both their personalities and in their careers. And it's been a fascinating experience for me to have, over the years, known both of them and admired and loved them both as dear friends. And I would put it this way, and I think Philip anticipated how I would characterize George in a way, but I would call Edward the consummate public intellectual who managed to bring a magnetic personality to bear on his deeply felt commitments and his exceptional scholarship. And it was, in other words, part of what accounted for his impact was this mixture of personality and brilliance. And in George's case, I would call him the consummate insider, a person who didn't feel comfortable or inclined to be on the public square, and at the same time shared the same basic worldview with Edward Said, but he did so by shaping the way in which law developed, and he's had this extraordinary influence on international humanitarian law and the right to development and other areas, and as both an an extraordinary legal scholar and a notable legal practitioner whose personality, again, was one that combined this intellectual quality with a enchanting charm, so that even those that disagreed with him came to enjoy being with him. So when he worked, he often told me, I like working in the belly of the beast. That was a favorite phrase of George's. And it was a little bit of self-irony in that phrase, because I think what he meant was that the craft of working as a legal specialist within a variety of contexts that involve tribunals and arbitral negotiations and scholarly gatherings and his teaching experience, which was always central to his personality, whether he was in the classroom or not. I feel I was, when we were both students together, he was my teacher in part. And I learned more from him in that year we spent together at Harvard than I did from the Harvard faculty. And that's not saying a great deal, but at least at that time. And we had a sort of triumvirate with Saul Mendelowitz, and that was, again, a mixture of the warmth of friendship with a dedication to what we could hope and work for in terms of the betterment of humanity. And I think that those kind of lifelong commitments have been the sustaining ground of both our friendship and mutual respect. And it's been, for me, a important kind of relationship. One test of George's non-judgmental character when it comes to friendship was that he had a certain contempt for my background in international law, which was received at Yale University, and through the sort of controversial teaching of Myers McDougall and the so-called New Haven School. And that was an anathema. Unlike what Philip is saying, I didn't find George very interested in a conversation about its virtue, its potential virtues. He had his hard side, and that was displayed toward. But somehow or other, it didn't affect our human interaction. And I, like Danny, regarded, even though I'm older than George, believe it or not, I regarded him as a kind of, in an unconscious way, as a mentor, because of this quality of lucidity and precision and depth of knowledge and the power of his empathy for struggles of those who were abused and oppressed. He gave me a kind of living model of what I might aspire to be in both professionally and humanly. And over the passage of years, he's grown old, as all of us have, but somehow that continuity of belief and commitment have been unaffected by age. He's remained what one might call a pure being with that fused the mind with the heart. And again, that's not so, shouldn't be taken for granted in the academic world. In fact, it's as rare as some of the endangered species. And finally, I would say, sort of echoing what Philip said earlier, that one of my real adult pleasures has been this long friendship with George, and it's such an honor for me to be here to celebrate his 90th birthday. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to share this second panel with two distinguished former students of Professor George Abi-Saab, Judge Abdulkawi Yusuf and Professor Laurence Wasson de Chassourne. This second part of this event will deal with more concrete issues concerning the manner in which George influenced international law in different aspects. So no one better than the former president of the International Court of Justice to speak about the role that Judge George Abi-Saab played in two contentious cases in which he acted as ad hoc judge at the International Court of Justice. So without further ado, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. And it is a joy, really, to be back here at the Institute and to participate in the celebration of what Professor Andrew Clapham called it, the 18th birthday of George Abi-Saab. So happy birthday, first of all, George. And I wish to thank Marcelo, because I think without Marcelo, we would not have had this opportunity. He has been a better son than most of us, you know. Yeah. I came to Geneva in 1977 to the Graduate Institute because of George Abi-Saab, because I really wanted to study with him. And I wanted to study with him because he was already contributing to the progress of international law, but for me, from a perspective which I admire, and I wanted to learn more about that perspective, because George, in my view, was contributing to the development of international law by being the voice of the third world, by being the intellectual voice of the newly independent states. Because the newly independent states were still trying to articulate their conception of international law, their approaches to international law, but they did not have enough intellectual voices to conceptualize and to express their viewpoint. And when I read the articles written by George Abi-Saab, I really wanted to study with him and to do my PhD with him. And I was lucky that I had a good friend from Tunisia called Kamil Marjan, who was a student of George and who introduced me to George, because I was attending the Law of the Sea conference here in Geneva, and Kamil Marjan was also a member of the delegation of Tunisia, and he said, I'll take you tomorrow to meet George Abi-Saab if you want to meet George Abi-Saab. And I said, okay. And we came to the institute. So that is how I came to the institute, and that's why I am extremely grateful to George, because I have learned most of what I know from him as far as international law is concerned. And I don't think that I would have arrived where I have reached in my profession and in my intellectual development without having worked with him. So it is a privilege for me, therefore, to be here today to participate in this celebration of his 18th birthday, yeah. And it's not yet 20. And I would like to talk in particular about the professor as a judge ad hoc. Because as you know, the institution of judge ad hoc, before George was chosen as a judge ad hoc by the Republic of Mali in 1983, it was mostly an institution of a national judge. Most of the judge ad hocs were actually nationalists of the countries which chose them and then were appointed by the court. But the Judge Abi-Saab was not a national of Mali, nor was he a national later of Chad. He was an Egyptian who was chosen by these two African states because of his knowledge of international law and because of his specialist skills and because of his fame as an international lawyer. At the same time, we all know that at that time, especially in the 1950s, the institution of a judge ad hoc was a much maligned institution. I remember that Henry Roland wrote in 1954 that un juge ad hoc, c'est un espion de son gouvernement. He is a spy of his government, because they were nationals of the government that appointed them. And Marcus Huber said something similar. He said that the institution of a judge ad hoc is actually contrary to the very concept of the judicial settlement of disputes. But I disagree respectfully with both of them. I disagree with them because actually a judge ad hoc can contribute a lot to the work of the court. And I think that since then, Rosalind Higgins has written a very famous article on that and has reproduced it also in Oppenheim, the United Nations, in which she says that the court has found very useful the work of judges ad hoc. I'm not saying that because I started my career as a judge ad hoc, because before I was elected as a regular judge, I was also a judge ad hoc in a case between Djibouti and France. No, I'm not saying that, but I am actually speaking from experience because I know when the judge ad hoc knows about the background of a case, how much the judge ad hoc can contribute to the deliberations of the court. But you know, the deliberations of a court, especially the International Court of Justice, I'm talking now here about the International Court of Justice, are confidential. So I cannot tell you today that I am quite sure that George Abi-Saab contributed concretely this to the formulation or the drafting of the judgment on Mali, Burkina Faso, or Libya, Chad, because that is really confidential, and we don't even keep minutes of the deliberations of the court on a case, because there is always the danger that they may leak, and therefore people will know who said what, who wrote what, who argued what, and that is what we always try to avoid. But let me first of all put it in context and the circumstances in which George arrived at the court as a judge ad hoc. It was 1983. The court had actually crossed the Sahara. It was a very difficult period for the court since the regretful and the controversial judgment on the Southwest Africa cases in 1966. There were hardly any cases brought to the International Court of Justice between 66 and early 80s. And whenever cases were brought, many of the states would not appear. There was frequent non-appearance before the court. And the court was just starting to recover from that crisis. And the court thought that it could perhaps recover in a faster manner from this crisis if it revised its regulations, its rules, the rules of the court. And one way in which the court revised the rules was to introduce Rule 17, which is based on Article 27 or 26 of the statute of the court, concerning the creation or the establishment of chambers. And the court, in a way, softened the conditions for the determination of the composition of chambers and gave a wide latitude to the parties. And I remember, because I read it in the 1990s, that George wrote about that period also. And he wrote an article which I would recommend to all of you to read, because it is one of the best articles that have been written about the history of the International Court of Justice, and of course of its predecessor, but mainly about the history of the International Court of Justice. And I think it was Philip Alston who said that George is a wordsmith. And I remember that there were two words, one of them a word, the other one actually an expression which struck me and which are still in my mind whenever I actually think about the court. And for me, assessing how far the court has come and how much it has changed, I always use those words as a parameter, as a standard. And the first one was la arbitralisation de la Cour. I can't find an English word for it. Arbitralisation de la Cour. And the second one was transactional justice, justice transactionnelle. And up to now, whenever we are writing a judgment, I think about George Abi-Saab's justice transactionnelle. And I ask myself, is this what we are doing, or are we doing real justice here? You know, and it is really inspirational because it is something that I'm quite sure is not only in my mind, but must have been in the mind of many judges since the 1990s. So the court, and George was trying to tell the court, to send a message to the court, and to tell the court to stay faithful to its mission, to stay faithful to its nature of a judicial body, not to become an arbitral body, and not to engage in some sort of a diplomatic gymnastics, but to apply the law. And I think that because of the period which the court was going through, it was inevitable that some judges thought that they should perhaps try to make themselves more likable as an institution, not as individually, but as an institution to states, so that more states can come to the court. Today, we don't have that problem, and therefore we can afford not to engage in a transactional justice, George. We have too many cases, actually, you know. And the issue of the chamber is over, because even when we ourselves offer to the states that come before the court whether they would like to have a chamber, they say no, absolutely not. We want the entire court to deliberate on our case. So George came to the court at that time, at a time when the court was really recovering from a crisis and was trying to reform itself, but a reform which did not, unfortunately, go well, because it led, and I think the best example is the Gulf of Maine chamber. And I'm quite sure that you all remember it, you know, because it almost became like the Southwest African cases, because Canada and the United States came to the court, and of course, with the consent of the president of the court, they chose 5 judges from the Western countries. So where is the articles, where were the articles of the statute of the court, which said that the judges must come from the main legal systems, from the major legal systems, and from the main civilizations of the world? Where was that? So this actually turned it into an unpleasant experience, a sour experience, I would say. And we are lucky that the court was able to overcome that unpleasant experience. But that is when George came. And the other context of the time when George came is that it was a period of transition. African countries had recently become independent. They were still struggling with their frontiers, with their assiette territorial, with their boundaries. And of course, it was natural that some of them would have a boundary and territorial disputes. But they also were still in the colonial mentality, I should say, because the case for which George was chosen came to the court through a special agreement between Mali and Burkina Faso. And in a way, in their special agreement, they said that colonial law, French administrative law, should be applied to the settlement of their dispute. And this, of course, posed a problem. And it required intellectual experience and an intellectual solution without ignoring what the countries wanted in a way that would also save the face of the International Court of Justice. Because in 1983, for the International Court of Justice to apply colonial law would have really been paradoxical. And although the deliberations were confidential, I'm quite sure that George contributed in a great way to to finding a solution for this issue. Because you can, in a way, recognize some of the expressions and of the words that are used in the judgment. And it says very clearly that there is no continuum juris between colonial law and international law. And that is actually pure George Abi-Saab, if you want it, you know. You don't have to look for it anywhere. And as far as also the delimitation of the newly independent states' boundaries is concerned, George always spoke about the instantané, you know, the snapshot, which was taken at the time of independence. And so since I studied with him here, in 1983, when the judgment came out and I read this, I said to myself, oh, this is George's snapshot. But they mistranslated it, and they called it photograph in English. But in French, it was still instantané. So it was still pure George, you see. And you don't need to talk about the confidentiality of the... But you see, the problem is that despite the fact that I'm quite sure the other members of the chamber follow with George to a certain extent, they did not follow him all the way. And so George had to write a separate opinion and to express himself in that opinion that actually, although the court applied the principle, it did not take it all the way through. And he said that you have to walk along the path to the end. And I can, I think, find the words that he used, but they were more or less words to this effect, because he said, along that road, there can be no question of even circuitously finding in contemporary international law any retroactive legitimation whatever of colonialism as an institution. And this is really, these were very, very strong words at the time, very strong words. And it was because the court was searching for a legal title. And they thought that one of the elements which they could use in order to justify that there was such a legal title was a proposal in a letter written by a governor general of the French territory. And that is, I believe, what really offended George. And it is mainly about that proposal that he writes about in his separate opinion. And he says, when did a proposal become a legal title? So, and how could a proposal become a legal title? So this was a Mali, Burkina Faso. Libya, Chad is a little bit more intriguing. And, you know, it is in any case the role of the judge ad hoc in a chamber composed of 5 or 7 judges, including the 2 judges ad hoc. And the role of a judge ad hoc in the court sitting as a whole, then there will be 16 or 17 judges sitting together, is totally different. Because in a chamber, a judge ad hoc can have much more influence, and his or her contribution can actually have more impact. But it is difficult to find and even to identify the role that a judge ad hoc has had in a case which was handled by the court as a whole. And Libya-Chad was handled by the court as a whole. But what I find quite interesting was that George actually did not write a declaration or a separate opinion. He did not write anything. Of course, the country that chose him came out in a way with almost everything that it asked it for. That was Chad, and a large swathe of territory was given to it. But normally, a judge ad hoc will try to write something in order to tell the outside world, I was here, I contributed, and I did something, you know. But George decided just to keep silent because his counterpart, Judge Sete Camara, wrote a very strong dissenting opinion. And I don't know whether George did not want to be seen also as dissatisfied, and therefore he avoided writing something, or whether, as an Egyptian, and this also could be an explanation, but George can tell us about it, whether as an Egyptian who was chosen by Chad, he did not want to rub it in to the neighbor of Egypt, another Arab country, Libya, which lost a lot of territory. So whether he said, okay, Libya lost this territory, I don't want to, you know, celebrate victory and make it even more difficult for them to accept, you know. So whatever may have been the motive, I think we have lost something there, because we would have appreciated, George, if you had at least shared your thoughts with us, even in a declaration, you know, not even a separate opinion, but a declaration, you know. Yeah, yeah, it would have remained there. And well, I will stop there, and I thank you very much. But I think.
Cher Georges, changement de casting, puisque je vais parler dans une langue que Georges maîtrise parfaitement, mais qui n'est pas la langue anglaise, c'est la langue française. Et aussi changement de casting, puisque je n'ai pas le même genre que les personnes qui ont parlé avant moi. J'ai été je suis très heureuse d'être l'une des filles de Georges. Je n'étais pas la seule, et je dois vous dire que quand j'ai préparé cette allocution, j'ai pensé à une sœur, à une grande sœur, que c'était pas Virginia, parce que Virginia était plus âgée que moi, mais c'était Vera Gowland. Vera Gowland, qui était aussi une docteure de l'Institut, qui a été une professeure à l'Institut, et on est nombreux dans cette salle à se rappeler de Vera. Elle aurait beaucoup aimé être ici. Donc, Georges, c'est vraiment un grand plaisir d'être ici. Je voudrais dire cher Georges et chère Rosemary, parce que je pense qu'un grand homme ne peut pas être un grand homme sans une grande femme. Je suis très contente d'être ici. Vous êtes, et je n'ai trouvé que ce mot pour vous qualifier, vous êtes un grand maître. Vous êtes un grand maître, mais vous êtes un maître dans beaucoup d'aspects. Vous nous avez, comme il a été dit, vous nous avez goûté le sel de la vie, de la réflexion intellectuelle, puisqu'il est vrai, comme il a été dit par Philippe par exemple, que chaque fois qu'on est avec vous, on réfléchit, mais on n'a pas l'impression de réfléchir. C'est quelque chose de naturel. Mais Georges, c'est aussi un gourmet. Et donc, quand on va chez Georges, on boit du bon vin et on mange des très bonnes choses. Et j'ai toujours pensé que bien manger, bien boire, ça va avec bien penser, et qu'il faut aussi savoir cela. Et pour cela, Georges, nous vous remercions vraiment de nous avoir appris le mélange de ces genres. Alors vous êtes pour moi un grand maître aussi parce que de multiples façons, mais j'ai pensé à un aspect particulier, c'est celui selon lequel vous avez des propos structurants. Ce que vous dites structure la pensée de ceux qui vous entendent. Et ça, en réfléchissant à cette allocution, je pensais par exemple à l'image des États comme boule de billard, hein, la coexistence. Je pensais encore à l'affaire Tadić, l'arrêt de l'affaire Tadić, où vous nous avez donné cette vision systémique du chapitre 7. Personne ne l'avait fait avant et vous nous l'avez donné. Et puis, une pensée qui m'a accompagnée, je dois dire, dans toute ma carrière, c'est vos propos sur le droit de la coopération. Et vous avez, là, je vais me référer au cours magistral, le cours général de Georges à l'Académie de droit international. Je sais que beaucoup d'entre vous souhaitent qu'il soit publié en anglais. Je sais que Philippe Alston travaille à cela, mais véritablement, c'est une œuvre. C'est une œuvre qu'il faut absolument connaître en langue anglaise. Et dans ce cours général, vous vous référez à ce qui est dénommé la Summa Divisio du professeur Wolfgang Friedman, qui est celle du droit international de la coexistence et celle du droit international de la coopération. D'ailleurs, je dois vous dire en passant que moi, j'ai toujours été effrayée de la mort du professeur Friedman et j'ai lu et relu ce qui s'était passé. C'est un professeur qui était un professeur sans doute extraordinaire et qui a été tué à New York. Il avait déjà été attaqué dans ce même quartier. Et il est parti en laissant une pensée. Et je pense que ce que vous voulez dire dans votre cours général, c'est qu'il a laissé une fulgurance en ce sens qu'il a compris que le droit international n'était plus le droit simplement de la coexistence, mais il était aussi celui de la coopération. Mais, comme vous le dites dans votre cours général, il n'a pas véritablement systématisé cette fulgurance. Et je voudrais vous dire qu'en vous relisant, j'ai trouvé qu'il y a beaucoup d'éclairs qui me sont venus. Et tout d'abord, vous montrez que cette division, et donc coexistence, coopération, et notamment la coopération, doit être contextualisée. Et donc, pour contextualiser la coopération, eh bien, il faut se pencher sur des corps de normes particuliers, puisque la coopération n'est pas univoque. Elle a un contenu qui peut varier selon les champs d'application. Alors, pour cela, je vais donner deux exemples. Le premier, c'est le domaine des droits de la personne humaine. Je suis dans une salle où il y a beaucoup de spécialistes de cette question. Je me hasarde sur ce chemin, mais on le sait tous, dans la Charte des Nations Unies, dans les grandes conventions de droits de l'homme, il y a l'obligation de coopération. Mais finalement, ce que montrent ces instruments de droits de l'homme, c'est que la coopération acquiert une finalité dans le contexte des droits de l'homme, puisque pourquoi est-ce qu'on coopère? C'est pour promouvoir le bien-être humain, c'est pour légitimer la coopération. Et cela, Georges nous l'a expliqué de manière très clairvoyante quand il a, par exemple, travaillé sur le droit au développement. Je dois dire que, genre, tout ce que vous avez écrit sur le droit au développement, les principes d'une nouvelle économique internationale me sont restés et m'ont marqué. Et dans ce contexte, alors je vais vous montrer une photo. C'était à l'époque, quand Georges travaillait sur toutes ces questions, qu'il écrivait le rapport pour le secrétaire général des Nations Unies et qu'il pensait, qu'il conceptualisait la question de la coopération au développement et du droit au développement. Et je me suis toujours demandé si c'était le chat qui vous avait inspiré, ou si la bonne nourriture de Rosemary, je ne sais pas. Mais en tout cas, nous avez fourni dans ce contexte une raison d'être à la coopération, et on a mieux compris ce que ça voulait dire que de coopérer pour la promotion du développement. Alors, je prends un autre exemple, c'est la protection de l'environnement. On le sait tous, protéger l'environnement, tout État doit le faire, mais on ne peut pas le faire sans coopération. Et dans ce contexte, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que pour véritablement pousser les États à coopérer, il faut faire appel à une éthique, à une morale politique, à une responsabilisation. Et là, la coopération, c'est ce que Georges nous a appris, elle se contextualise. Et dans ce contexte, on voit que les États doivent le faire puisqu'ils sont redevables. Et on leur explique qu'ils sont redevables, ils ont des objectifs. Et puis tout cela doit être rendu public sur le web. Et donc il y a une sorte de peer pressure qui s'exerce par les États, mais aussi par les citoyens, par nous-mêmes. Et c'est une dimension de la coopération qui me paraît très intéressante. Et quand on y réfléchit bien, on voit qu'il y a des coopérations, des fertilisations croisées, puisque ce qui se passe dans le domaine des droits de l'homme avec l'examen périodique universel, ça ressemble à du peer pressure. C'est du peer pressure pour dire aux États, rendez-vous compte de ce que vous faites et faites plus. Et en même temps, je crois que la protection de l'environnement, pour améliorer la coopération, gagnerait à plus parler de la dignité humaine, des droits de la nature, bien sûr, mais aussi de la dignité humaine. C'est pour permettre aux habitants de vivre mieux que l'on coopère afin de protection de l'environnement. Alors, un autre éclairage donné par Georges dans son cours magistral sur la coopération, c'est le fait qu'un sujet peut être réglementé à la fois par une approche de coexistence et par une approche de coopération. Et là, vous le dites, Wolfgang Friedman ne l'avait pas théorisé cela. Et vous dites finalement, coexistence et coopération ont des rapports dialectiques. Alors là, j'ose parler d'un sujet à propos duquel nous avons un grand maître dans la salle, le droit des cours d'eau internationaux, et je pense au professeur Kaflich que je vois. Finalement, le droit des cours d'eau s'est beaucoup développé dans le contexte de la coexistence, où on a essayé d'agencer les rapports entre les États. Mais on voit que ça ne suffit pas, cet agencement de la coexistence, qu'il faut de la coopération, et notamment pour prendre en compte la ressource naturelle qu'est l'eau, et le fait qu'il y a des écosystèmes à protéger. Et dans ce contexte, je voudrais évoquer, Abdi l'a fait pour le rôle de Georges comme juge ad hoc dans l'affaire Mali-Burkina Faso, mais votre opinion sur les marais, comme on les appelait, ces surfaces d'eau dans la région qui séparait le Mali et le Burkina Faso, je m'en sers très souvent parce que vous avez eu la mort dans l'âme, vous avez dû accepter le tracé de la frontière, parce qu'il fallait bien tracer cette frontière, mais en même temps, ce n'était pas une manière de régler l'accès à l'eau entre les populations qui vivaient dans ces deux États. Et donc, voilà, il y a une logique de coopération qui doit émerger. Il y a des manifestations de cette coopération. La question que je me suis posée, et comme ça nous permettra de discuter une prochaine fois où je viendrai vous rendre visite, c'est de me dire finalement, mais est-ce qu'il ne faut pas qu'on trouve un autre mot que la coopération? Est-ce que la coopération suffit? Que veut-elle dire véritablement? Alors j'ai pensé à la solidarité, mais je ne suis pas sûre encore que ce soit un ersatz pour parler d'une coopération nécessaire. En tout cas, dans le domaine de l'environnement, il est sûr, quand on pense au changement climatique, que l'on doit tous être solidaires les uns des autres si l'on veut véritablement faire face au risque de l'augmentation de la température. Et alors, dans ce contexte de réflexion sur une nouvelle forme de coopération, eh bien, je vais citer un dernier propos de Georges qui dit « Il ne peut pas y avoir de coopération sans substrat institutionnel. Il faut qu'il y ait un support institutionnel. » Et là, dans ce contexte, il me semble que le droit des organisations internationales a été un champ de réflexion de Georges, mais il me semble que là encore, pour tous les jeunes qui sont dans cette salle, il y a des espaces de création qui doivent être ouverts pour mieux agencer la gouvernance, par exemple, des ressources en eau, des ressources naturelles partagées ou des ressources communes. Voilà, alors donc avec ces propos, je vous remercie et si j'ose le dire, je vais vous dire Happy birthday, Mr. Professor.
So before starting, I would like to let you know that there is a book outside at the entrance of this auditorium in which, if you wish, and you are kindly invited to do so, you can write a few words to George. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, okay, so you see,
This is a permanent problem I have always had here at the Graduate Institute with my former students, but also with Professor Abi-Saab, who always, all of you are asking me to speak louder. I'm retired. I'm a retired person, so at this stage of my life, it's not easy to change mind. But anyway, je dois changer de langue parce que, au fond, je rappelle toujours que l'Institut est un institut dans lequel on a 2 langues de travail, mais aussi parce que j'ai toujours parlé avec Georges en français. Même si le premier séminaire auquel j'ai assisté avec Georges, c'était en anglais. Et pour moi, c'était un effort. Je dois l'avouer, à ce stade, je peux le faire. Et certains ou certaines de mes prédécesseurs ici ont rappelé les premiers moments dans lesquels ils ont rencontré Georges. Je dois dire que personnellement, ça a été plutôt problématique. En fait, Georges, il m'a grondé comme un enfant parce que je suis arrivé en retard à son séminaire. La première séance de son séminaire, je suis arrivé en retard. Ce n'était pas parce que je suis argentin, comme il le sait. Mais je n'ai jamais expliqué à Georges la vraie raison de cela. Et peut-être, 36 ans, je peux me permettre de le dire. En fait, c'était la faute du responsable du département qui recevait un an les doctorants, et c'était lui qui était en retard. Donc, je profite 36 ans plus tard pour te dire, Georges, ce n'était pas ma faute. La première fois que tu m'as rencontré, et c'était aussi dans un séminaire dans lequel on a beaucoup évoqué la problématique, un autre mot que Georges aime bien, dans n'importe quelle langue il parle. La problématique était précisément les délimitations territoriales et maritimes. Et ce n'était pas par hasard si je suis arrivé à l'Institut 4 ans après l'arrêt Burkina Faso-Mali et que j'ai fait ma thèse de doctorat sur ces sujets. Je pourrais dire beaucoup de choses sur ce que je dois à Georges de tout point de vue, du point de vue académique, du point de vue personnel, mais je préfère le faire personnellement. Et je vais plutôt, les titres que j'avais donnés ici pour cette présentation, c'était Georges Abi-Saab, un pionnier de la vision tiers-mondiste du droit international. Et nous fêtons aujourd'hui le 90e anniversaire, je peux le dire, ce n'est pas le 18e, d'un véritable internationaliste. Malgré ses contacts avec plusieurs cultures et pays, il a été formé dans plusieurs institutions universitaires de différentes régions et traditions. Malgré le fait qu'il parle parfaitement 3 langues et qu'il les écrit et les lit, Georges n'est pas un cosmopolite ou un citoyen du monde, ce sont 2 termes qui sont aujourd'hui à la mode. Et sur cela, je voulais évoquer Rousseau, parce que quand on parle beaucoup de cosmopolites, donc Rousseau disait « Ces prétendus cosmopolites qui justifient leur manque d'amour pour la patrie par leur amour pour le genre humain se vantent d'aimer tout le monde pour avoir droit de n'aimer personne. » Et Georges Abi-Saab, au contraire, il aime beaucoup. Et il aime suffisamment pour être à la fois égyptien, africain, arabe, méditerranéen, tiers-mondiste et internationaliste. Georges Abi-Saab est un internationaliste dans les divers sens du terme. Bien entendu, dans le sens que nous utilisons en droit comme un juriste spécialisé en droit international, mais aussi dans le sens de ceux et celles qui embrassent la solidarité entre les peuples et qui ressentent les joies et les souffrances des autres comme des joies et des souffrances propres. Il est à la fois théoricien, enseignant et praticien du droit international. ce qui se traduit en 3 gestes: réfléchir, dire et agir. C'est une constante en lui, ces 3 éléments. Et je suis très, très heureux de voir ici plusieurs générations de ces enfants intellectuels, comme ils aiment nous appeler, et beaucoup aussi d'anciens collègues et amis qui sont réunis pour fêter cet anniversaire. Donc, je vais parler de Georges comme un pionnier ou précurseur des visions tiers-mondistes de droit international. Et là, je vous prie de vous placer dans l'année 1960. C'est une année très importante dans la lutte contre le colonialisme. C'est l'année où l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies a adopté la célèbre résolution 1514 sur, le titre n'est pas très bon, l'octroi de l'indépendance aux pays et peuples coloniaux. Mais c'était un grand moment dans l'histoire des relations internationales et des Nations Unies en particulier. 1960, donc c'était presque le début, même si certains États étaient arrivés à l'indépendance précédemment, certains de ces États nouvellement indépendants, c'était à partir de cette résolution qui s'est produit un véritable changement même dans la composition des Nations Unies. Et Georges, en 1960, publie The Newly Independent States and the Scope of Domestic Jurisdiction. Et si vous voulez aller aux Proceedings de l'American Society of International Law de 1960, vous trouverez sa contribution. Et 2 années plus tard, The Newly Independent States and the Rule of International Law. De nouveau, il y a même ce concept Newly Independent States, États nouvellement indépendants. Je ne sais pas si c'est l'apanage de Georges, cette terminologie, mais c'est la terminologie qui, par la suite, a eu droit de citer et a été employée par la Commission de droit international, par exemple, lorsque elle s'est penchée sur les problèmes de succession d'États. Et Georges est un ancien de l'Académie de droit international. Il a eu le diplôme de l'Académie de droit international et il a écrit pour l'annuaire de l'Association des anciens étudiants de l'Académie de droit international, aussi en 1962, Peaceful Change and the Integration of the Newly Independent States in the International Community. C'est-à-dire que ce sont, si vous voulez, ce sont les premiers travaux en droit international où on se penche sur la question des États nouvellement indépendants, de leur rôle et de leur présence dans la communauté internationale de l'époque. Et 2 sujets marquent à cette époque l'axe de sa pensée et des efforts des États nouvellement indépendants, le développement et le droit des peuples à disposer d'eux-mêmes. On a déjà mentionné son rapport au secrétaire général Développement progressif des principes et normes de droit international relatifs au nouvel ordre économique international. Et le droit des peuples à disposer d'eux-mêmes, Georges a porté un intérêt sur cette question, je dirais, de tout point de vue, non seulement au point de vue de la théorie, non seulement au point de vue de la pratique, mais aussi de l'enseignement. Et l'un de ses premiers enseignements dans cette maison, pas dans la maison de la paix, mais à l'Institut, c'était un séminaire sur les droits des peuples à disposer d'eux-mêmes, que je crois, sans avoir fait une recherche, a dû être le premier enseignement au monde dans lequel on s'attelle exclusivement au traitement du principe d'autodétermination, si on utilise un anglicisme. On a déjà évoqué aussi le rôle de Georges à la conférence internationale qui a fini par élaborer les 2 protocoles additionnels aux conventions de Genève en 1977 et sa contribution pour faire entrer les peuples, les mouvements de libération nationale et leur lutte dans ces instruments internationaux. je peux mentionner aussi dans ce domaine son cours, son premier cours à l'Académie de droit international de La Haye de 1979, où je vous invite non seulement à le lire si vous ne l'avez pas encore fait, les nouvelles générations, mais aussi à jeter un coup d'œil. Je n'ai pas pris sa photo, mais regardez sa photo aussi en 1979 de Georges avec des lunettes plutôt obscures, parlant des guerres de libération nationale, et que je pense a dû effrayer plus d'un. Le juge Youssouf a déjà parlé de deux affaires dans lesquelles il a agi comme juge ad hoc, Burkina Faso, Mali et Libye-Tchad. Et j'ajouterai quelque chose. La relation entre les titres et les effectivités, où on peut aussi voir ou imaginer une contribution certaine de Georges dans cette question, où je pense que pour la première fois dans une décision juridictionnelle, il est expliqué avec clarté que la pure effectivité n'est pas le maître mot dans le domaine de la souveraineté territoriale. Et même chose à propos du principe du respect des frontières héritées au moment de la décolonisation. Effectivement, il y a un effort de Georges pour distinguer. Une chose, c'est accepter l'instantané territorial existant au moment même de l'indépendance, et une autre chose, c'est de dire c'est le droit colonial qui prime. Mais il y a cet effort pour éviter des luttes fratricides, et c'est important de le rappeler aujourd'hui, et cette idée de que les États nouvellement indépendants, plutôt que se combattre pour délimiter leur sphère de souveraineté territoriale, il valait mieux se concentrer sur leur développement et sur les progrès des sociétés concernées. Mais je voulais, à propos de la Cour internationale de justice, évoquer aussi sa participation, non pas comme juge ad hoc, mais comme avocat et conseil. J'évoquerai seulement ici sa participation dans deux avis consultatifs très importants. L'avis consultatif sur la légalité de la menace du recours aux armes nucléaires, où il a parlé au nom de l'Égypte, et l'avis consultatif sur la construction d'un mur en territoire palestinien occupé, où il a parlé au nom de la Palestine. Et là, on voit aussi l'harmonie entre ce qu'il a produit théoriquement et avec son activité pratique pour promouvoir la paix, le désarmement, l'autodétermination et contre l'occupation militaire. Je dirais que comme pionnier dans cette perspective tiers-mondiste du droit international, dans les années 60 et 70, je dirais, si on veut faire une classification, il y avait trois perspectives tiers-mondistes. Il y avait celles qui croyaient qu'on pouvait changer le monde en adoptant des résolutions de l'Assemblée générale et qu'il était suffisant une résolution pour changer le monde. Et il y avait aussi, ça c'était les optimistes à outrance, et il y avait aussi les pessimistes à outrance, ceux qui estimaient qu'avec une vision très manichéenne, considérant le droit international comme une partie de la superstructure, et donc le droit international était un instrument permanent de domination des puissants sur les opprimés, et que par conséquent le droit international n'était pas le droit international du développement, mais le droit international du sous-développement. Et puis il y a la vision de Georges Abi-Saab, qui n'est ni cet optimisme à outrance, ni ce pessimisme à outrance. Il a été le premier à développer une analyse du droit international à travers la perspective du tiers-monde, mais il l'a fait non pas pour faire dire au droit international ce qu'il ne dit pas, ni pour croire non plus dans des miracles normatifs. Mais Georges Abi-Saab à interpréter le droit international en tant que réalité sociale, à partir de la conception du monde qui est la sienne, et son analyse se fonde ainsi sur l'examen des règles et des institutions internationales qui composent un système juridique, une chose sur laquelle il a toujours insisté, un système juridique, et qui s'applique à un corps social déterminé, la communauté internationale, à la lumière d'une finalité. Et la finalité que Georges a toujours embrassée, c'est la justice sociale internationale. Cette manière de concevoir le droit international constitue une intégration harmonieuse de plusieurs éléments. Le droit international comme système, comme réalité sociale et comme l'expression des valeurs prépondérantes. Et cette vision permet une analyse globale du phénomène juridique international qui dépasse les grilles d'analyse unidimensionnelles, je dirais, des courants de pensée classiques dans ces différentes versions, positivistes ou naturalistes, mais aussi des courants aujourd'hui à la mode, centrés sur un soi-disant réalisme qui cache une justification de la prépondérance du pouvoir, ou soit d'une soi-disant étude critique stérile qui conduit au nihilisme. Il n'y a rien de plus éloigné dans la pensée de Georges Abi-Saab que le dogmatisme, sous quelque forme que ce soit, tout comme la manifestation d'une prétendue objectivité. Tous les étudiants de Georges et les étudiantes qui sont là se rappellent parfaitement ce qu'il nous a toujours dit, sa maxime sur l'objectivité, la meilleure manière d'être objectif, pour un chercheur en sciences sociales, c'est de relever ses propres subjectivités. Je crois pouvoir parler au nom de toutes ces générations d'étudiantes et d'étudiants en affirmant que Georges Abi-Saab n'est pas seulement un grand maître du droit international, mais aussi et avant tout un humaniste. Toujours fidèle à ses convictions, il nous a transmis un programme, voire une philosophie de vie. Dire ce que l'on pense et agir en conformité avec ce que l'on dit. Son message est le message d'un optimiste ayant les pieds fermement sur terre. Les choses sont perfectibles, nous dit-il, dans l'introduction de son cours général à l'Académie de droit international de La Haye. Georges nous a appris que le droit international, sans être en soi le changement, peut être un instrument de changement. L'outil du faible face au puissant. Le droit international ne peut certes créer les meilleurs des mondes, mais ce sera son application et son développement qui conduira cependant à un monde meilleur. Merci Georges pour tout ce que tu nous as appris. Merci pour ta vitalité. Merci pour ta clairvoyance et pour le plaisir que nous avons tous et toutes de te rencontrer et de nous éclairer jour après jour avec ta pensée et tout ce que nous dis, tout ce que tu nous dis chaque fois qu'on a le plaisir de te rencontrer. Merci, merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, c'est le moment tant attendu, dans lequel Georges nous fera ces quelques remarques conclusives et qui, certainement, et là je profite parce que pendant les interventions que nous avons entendues, on a mentionné tous, nous avons tous et toutes mentionné certaines visions de Georges. Peut-être que Georges n'est pas d'accord avec nous. Et il y a un point, il y a une brèche qui a été ouverte que j'ai hésité à entrer dans le débat, mais je ne l'ai pas fait. Le droit international dans cette maison a eu une forte influence kelsenienne, c'est tout à fait vrai. Mais je me demande ce que Georges peut dire sur sa prétendue, au moins une petite filiation kelsenienne. Moi, j'ai des doutes à ce propos, mais laissons Georges dire tout ce qu'il a à nous dire. Merci.
Voilà.
Micro. Baissez le micro.
Oui, ça va. Merci. Chers amis, je considère d'ailleurs tous ceux qui sont ici sont des amis, parce qu'ils sacrifient 2-3 heures. C'est la seule ressource non renouvelable. Ils sacrifient quelques heures de leur vie pour venir entendre des gens qui parlent autour de ma personne. Je dois dire, je dois les considérer comme des amis parce que c'est un grand sacrifice de venir ici et de rester jusqu'à au-delà de 6 heures, qui est l'heure d'arrêt de toute activité lucrative, en tout cas. Je dois commencer par dire combien je suis ému et aussi surpris, parce que franchement, la personne qui était le sujet de tous ces discours me paraît très différent de l'image que je vois dans ma miroir. C'est un peu idéalisé, quelquefois même biaisé, mais biaisé en faveur, mais quand même. Donc, je suis un peu ému de tout cela. Mais surtout, je suis très content de me trouver ici dans un amphithéâtre et dans l'atmosphère qui m'a toujours revivifié et m'a donné toujours beaucoup d'énergie et de joie d'être là. Je crois qu'une des plus grandes aberrations, c'est de mettre une limite d'âge aux activités intellectuelles, que ce soit enseignant ou artiste ou écrivain. D'habitude, l'âge de maturité est l'âge où on peut donner le plus, et puis ils vous disent, vous avez suffisamment travaillé, allez chercher ailleurs. Bon, parce que pour moi, j'ai passé presque 40 ans à enseigner à cet institut, et c'était the best years of my life. Il y a un fameux film, The Best 3 Years of Our Lives, et c'était parce que, pour moi, être professeur, ce n'est pas être quelqu'un qui a un titre, mais c'est quelqu'un qui exerce la meilleure profession du monde. Je vais vous dire pourquoi. J'ai fait beaucoup d'autres choses et j'ai vu des gens qui faisaient autre chose encore. Toutes les activités humaines, sauf des très petites exceptions, étaient ce qu'on appelle dans la science politique a zero-sum game. C'est-à-dire, il y a toujours quelqu'un qui interagit avec un autre pour gagner quelque chose, aux dépens de l'autre.
la seule activité non-serious game, c'est en fait l'enseignement dans le vrai sens du mot. C'est-à-dire, quand quelqu'un professe ou exerce cette profession, non pas comme professionnel, mais comme amateur. Pourquoi je vous dis amateur? Parce que amateur vient, la racine, c'est l'amour. Il le fait parce qu'il aime ce qu'il fait, parce qu'il veut le faire, pas parce qu'il veut gagner de l'argent, pas parce qu'il veut gagner du prestige, mais parce que l'activité elle-même lui donne une grande satisfaction. Mais comment il peut, pourquoi c'est une zero-sum game? Parce que s'il le fait bien, il ne doit pas simplement prodiguer de l'information. Il doit essayer de penser à haute voix et essayer de réfléchir avec son audience, de sorte qu'il les incite à réfléchir avec lui. Ça devient une activité commune, même quand vous donnez un cours ex cathedra. Si vous posez pas mal de questions problématiques, comme a dit Marcelo, vous essayez d'inciter les gens de penser avant vous, d'essayer de voir qu'est-ce que vous pouvez dire. Vous examinez les différentes possibilités, par exemple, etc. En fin de compte, on peut faire un breakthrough. On peut prendre notre pensée collective un pas au devant. Et c'est un peu, c'était ma manière d'enseigner, et je crois que mes étudiants, et la preuve est qu'ayant arrêté il y a plus que 20 ans, ils sont tous là, ou une grande majorité, hein, ont apprécié cette manière, et ça l'a excité aussi, les inciter aussi à aller au devant. Et c'est vrai que, comme quelqu'un a dit en anglais, he pushed his students to their limit, even if they were reluctant. Hein? C'est-à-dire les mener autant que possible. Hein? Je ne dirais pas jusqu'à leur limite, parce qu'il n'y a pas de limite. Hein? On peut toujours grandir. Mais pour beaucoup de gens, le doctorat, par exemple, est la dernière étape où ils sont contrôlés. Et c'est important, effectivement, de ne pas les pousser jusqu'au point où c'est suffisant pour avoir le degré, c'est suffisant pour avoir une bonne thèse. Non, je veux la meilleure thèse, et ainsi de suite. Donc, c'était une activité très enrichissante. Et dans mon cours général à La Haye, qui était donné en français, j'ai écrit qu'il n'y a pas dans ce cours une seule idée personnelle qui n'a pas été le résultat de mon enseignement et mes interactions avec mes étudiants. Moi, je ne suis pas un type qui reste devant l'écran. D'ailleurs, je n'utilise pas le computer, c'est trop moderne pour moi, hein, ou le papier, et les idées jaillissent. Hein. Mon cher ami Dick Folk, qui est là, il me dit « I can't think without writing ». Et moi, « I can't think if I write ». Because je commence à chercher des mots et le flot de la pensée s'interrompt. D'ailleurs, pour la Cour internationale, alors Abdillah, il nous demande de donner les plaidoiries orales. Alors, si vous leur donnez un texte qui est une plaidoirie orale, c'est un oxymoron, hein, parce qu'oral, c'est-à-dire oral. La première fois où j'ai plaidé devant la Cour, j'ai donné un texte, mais c'était un skeleton. Hein, mais après, maintenant, il vous demande même quelquefois de donner la traduction. Hein, parce que, alors, la seule manière, c'était que ma pauvre femme, et s'il y a quelqu'un que je connais, je leur invite, et je fais ma plaidoirie en l'enregistrant, et puis je l'écris, et je leur donne le texte, parce que ça ne me vient pas en écrivant en premier. Bon, c'est pour dire que vraiment, l'enseignement est une profession fantastique, et je remercie l'Institut, je remercie surtout le professeur Frémont, qui était le directeur de l'Institut dans le temps, de m'avoir nommé. Moi, en fait, on était les deux premiers du tiers-monde, et Harish Kapoor de l'Inde, dans la section de sciences politiques, qui nous a donné cette occasion, et pour moi, donné l'occasion d'exercer ce métier que je voulais faire depuis que j'étais petit. Hein, c'était une vocation précoce. Je dois dire aussi que je suis très content de pouvoir parler un peu en français, parce que ce qui m'a attiré à l'Institut en premier lieu, c'était le caractère bilingue. Et je venais, après tout, après 6 ans dans les pays anglo-saxons, passant de Michigan, où je faisais de l'économie, à Harvard, à Cambridge, et ça m'a plu de revenir vers le français, qui était ma première langue étrangère. Mais je dois m'excuser maintenant parce que beaucoup de nos amis ici, certains ne connaissent pas suffisamment le français pour suivre ce qui est dit, et je veux dire quelques mots en anglais. Alors, I was thanking my friends here, all the audience. I consider my friends to have sacrificed several hours of their life to come and hear speeches about me. I am not sure that it was the best investment, but anyway. And I wanted to speak a little bit in French because that was really one of the great aspects of the Institute, to be bilingual. Now I would like to make some remarks about the very generous, perhaps exaggeratedly generous speeches that I heard up to now. They didn't coincide exactly with my self-image, but anyway, it's better than the reverse. Now, what can I say about what? I have very little to say about what Danny Warner said. In fact, he insisted to work with me. And then I told him, you know, ethics and morals have some resemblance with the concept of responsibility in law. Why don't you try to see what is the junction between the two. And he did. And he started by writing things very hermetic. Now he is fantastic. He writes every week a blog which is very clear. It's really a pleasure to read him. And he is also very interested in the same subjects, but from an angle which is a little bit different. It's ethics in international relations, morality in international relations, to what extent it bears on what we live actually today, here and there in Ukraine, in the Sahel, and so forth. So, and I think that his thesis remains a very good piece of reflection about this aspect of morality and ethics. Actually, he is very inspired by one of my great masters of thought, Max Weber, on that point. Now, Philip Alston is an old friend. I met him at the end of the 70s, I think, or the beginning of the 80s, end of the 70s. And he came to work in the United Nations in the Secretariat of Human Rights, which was not the Council of Human Rights as it is now. It was just simply part of the Social and Economic Council Secretariat. And it was a time when this idea of the right to development was starting, and I was having several seminars and conferences about this subject. There was also my late colleague, senior colleague, I would say, because he was one generation before me, Professor Michel Virali. He was interested also in that. And Philip started to move around in this circle, and this is how we met. And I liked very much his dry sense of humor and his turn of phrases, including the wordsmith. He wordsmithed for me, but he is a master of it himself. And we have been very close friends since then, because he, one of the greatest experts of human rights in the world, respected for that, at the same time, the one who dares to criticize the high and the mighty by very, very strong words in reports and so forth, and really with great courage. And we have a lot of activities together. We have this oral history, and we try to do something more, and so forth. So I thank him again for his personal portrait, which was very, again, very idealized. My oldest friend here is Richard Falk. We met in 1958. That makes 65 years ago. I was 25. Now I am 90. And from the first moment, he and our third partner, Saul Mendelwitz, meshed together. Saul had studied, I was coming just from doing the pre-thesis studies of economics in Michigan. Saul was also started a PhD in sociology in Chicago, and then did the law school and was teaching at Rutgers. And we met, the three of us, we had the same view as Dick has mentioned, which was, this is a horrible world, and we have to try to see what we can do about it. This led to the World Order Models Project, which stayed for how many years? 50 years, perhaps, where we had people from all the world and from all the disciplines working on this model, the dystopia we are living, what is the utopia we would like, and what are the steps of transition. So it was really dreaming aloud in scientific terms. We were using our own knowledge, each from his side, to try to imagine, imagine like the Beatles, imagine the world. And it was a good speculation. It was a kind of an elating activity. Dick has just published 2 years ago his autobiography, which he called an autobiography of a public intellectual, because he is really a fighter. He is always in the forefront of progressive cases. While the US was bombarding Hanoi, he went to Hanoi in a peace mission, but popular peace mission, not governmental peace mission. He tried to defend the rights to the Palestinians and take the wrath which comes with such a position in the United States. He is very courageous, and he likes to speak in public and fight. Unfortunately, I don't have this. I'm a little bit timid, not with my friends and my students, but in general. But we both try to do the same thing in our own styles. The one thing I didn't like in his speech is to associate me with Kelsen. Because Kelsen is the one who developed the pure theory of law. And for him, pure theory, purified from any social content or value. I come from the sociological school. I claim to be from a sociological school, which considers law as a social product, the product of society. But at the same time, it's an instrument which could be used to improve society. However, it has an objective existence. It's not only in the mind of the one who thinks about law. It has an objective existence as language, as morality, as all the social products. And so in this, that's why I am not very appreciative of certain American schools, particularly the School of New Haven. I even told once to not the Pope, but the creator of this school, Professor Myers McDougall, everybody calls him Mac, and he's a very, very charming man. I told him, the proof that your school is not really scientific is that it has in it Dick Folk and Michael Riesman. who are so different from one another. One is the extreme right and the other is on the left. So, because what Riesman had just published a second edition of his Cours général. The first edition was rather flat. It was basically political science, as one of my students told me, who followed his course. But he tried to make it more legal and published a second version. And it's called Structural Processes and Personal Commitment. In other words, the structural processes is that you have to go, law is a process. In American lingo, due process meaning that you have to follow the right procedures. Okay, I agree, we have to follow the right procedures. But the procedures have to have an aim. And if you don't have an aim, the process leads you to what? The process has to be linked to some objective system, social system, which gives it its direction and also its terminus. You have a process to lead to this, to that. It's not enough to have a process. And it's not enough to have commitment, because the commitment of each of us is subjective. You are committed to your own values, to your own worldview. This does not create a legal system. The legal system has its own objective existence. And it is this, I think, what Dick wanted when he spoke about Kelsen. Because, okay, Kelsen has his system, but there are other systems. There is the system of Pashukanis, who was the first great Marxist thinker, for example. That was also very much an objective system, and so forth. So anyway, the way we perceive law is important, but what is more important is that law is a teleological system. It's not just a process, it's not a mechanism that works like a clock. No, it has, as de Vichère, the great Charles de Vichère, criticized Kelsen by saying, law is not just an empty boxes, and you just put them in order, one in relation to the other. Okay, so that's my little difference with Dick, but we agree on everything else. Now I come to the second round. I'm not sure I am not taking too much of your time. Could you give me another?
It's okay.
Okay. Yes. Now, President Abdul Qawi Yusuf, dear Abdi, he spoke about the judge ad hoc. And you know, this business of judge ad hoc is really very intriguing. And if I may share just a few observations with you on it. In 1960, the first piece which I wrote about the newly independent states, it was in a panel during the annual meeting of the American Society of International. And who was sharing this panel? It was my dear Dick Folk, who invited me to participate in it. So you see how things turn. In that meeting, the major speech was given by an Indian judge by the name of Judge Shagla. Judge Shagla had just sat as a judge ad hoc in a famous case, which is the right of passage over Indian territory. It's a right brought by Portugal because they had some colonies, but small colonies surrounded by Indian territory, and they had a right to pass through them, and India got this right. Anyway, India appointed Shagla as a judge ad hoc, and Shagla came to the American society to attack, to say he was not feeling comfortable as judge ad hoc, and it's an abhorrent system in the international court, etc., etc. Okay. This remained in my mind until I was contacted to be judge ad hoc for Mali. And now that is another story, because some of the students from the third world in neighboring France, some of them used to come to follow my seminar or to ask for. One of them was assistant in Lyon. His name was Blondin Bailly. And he finished his thesis and he disappeared. And suddenly I get a call from the embassy of Mali in Paris telling me that the foreign minister wants to see me. And they sent me a ticket, flying ticket. I thought they wanted a consultation, an opinion. I went there, and whom do I meet? It's Blondin Bailly. He was the foreign minister. And he asked me if I could sit as judge at home. I said, yeah, of course. But I want to see the case, because also, if you accept to be a judge ad hoc, one has to be honest with himself. If you see that it is a lost case, you'd better decline, or to be frank and tell the one who asked you to do it. Because it's very embarrassing to be there, nominated by a country, and you shouldn't defend. This is the problem. Judge ad hoc should not be a lawyer for his party, for the party that appointed. Then why should he be appointed in the first place? Oh, no, there is something still open. It is to make sure that the arguments, the case of the party that appointed you is well considered by the panel, by the court. You are not obliged to defend a position which you don't want to defend as a teacher, as a neutral. And I think this is important. And it is on that basis that one can be a judge ad hoc. In fact, this also happens in arbitration. But in arbitration it's very difficult because you have usually three, one appointed by each party and an umpire, a third. So the one who appoints you expects you to defend his case. And it's very difficult, in fact. But again, if you take this position, it's all right. It's all right if the other party, or if the one appointed by the other party takes the same position. But if the other party starts to be the lawyer of the party that appointed him, what can you do? You have to replicate in the same way. So there is a problem of arbitration, and this is why the arbitralization of the court is really very dangerous. The court is the voice of the legal system, the objective legal system. So it exists there, the legal system. And as an oracle of the legal system, it's very good. When you have 15 or 17, one voice cannot change much. But if you are reasonable and you whisper in the ear of the horse, as a judge ad hoc, even in the big panel, you can have an effect. But also, always, according to the objective solution which derives from objective law. So that's about the judge ad hoc. My dear Laurence, one of my best children, intellectual children, spoke about this summa divisio of Professor Friedman, which is dear to my heart because I think it portrays very well the development and evolution of international law. In the sense that international law, what they call the Westphalian system, which runs around the sovereign state. The sovereign has the last word. And here you have several sovereigns, so you say, okay, we will assume formally that you are equal. Each is sovereign in his realm, but you are equal before the law, which is not true. It doesn't reflect the reality of things. It makes international law, or the rules that are based on the protection and preservation of sovereignty, a very zero-sum game. I mean, it's all question of what can I have at the expense of the other. And that's the interaction. Okay. And this has not done very well. We have all, I mean, the history of sovereign states is a history of wars all along. The law of cooperation is a different type of law. It's a law based on common needs and common values. And this is why you can call it the law of the international community. It is based on the idea that you are living in a community, and this community has its own needs and values. And I would like to read to you a short passage I read by chance from a colleague, Professor Benvenisti from Cambridge, about sovereignty. And it illustrates very well the passage from the law of coexistence to the law of cooperation. Here it is. I don't see very well, so excuse me. In past decades, the predominant conception of sovereignty was akin to owning a large estate separated from other properties by rivers and deserts. By contrast, today's reality is more analogous to owning a small apartment in one densely packed high-rise building. That is home of 200 separate families. So that is it. The law of, you are living in an apartment, you have your apartment, but this apartment depends for water, for electricity, for the lift, for the sewage, on common services. It depends in a way. You have, living in a compact world is very different from living in a largely spaced world. And where you could fight for space, there in usually, that's the main causes of fights on territory. Now, you cannot, because you have common needs and you have common perils, and that is the most important thing. And you cannot deal with them solely on your part. You have to deal with them together with the others. And that is the law of cooperation. The difference between the two is that the law of coexistence, the virtue in the law of coexistence is abstention. You should not intervene in the realm of the other, in the affairs of the other. But in the law of cooperation, no, you have to do things together, which you cannot do by yourself, or which, if you do by yourself, will not give satisfactory results. The only way is to do it together. So it is not also a question of fields. You say this is law, and that is unfortunately the mistake of that great man who was Professor Friedman. He confused this. It is the way you regulate legally the problems. Do you regulate them in the concept of proceeding from sovereignty or from the idea of common needs and common interests and values? So that is, I think, something which has become very clear now with the pandemic, with global warming, with all these perils, which cannot be fought single-handedly by any state, however big and mighty it may be. I think I spoke too much. So I thank you very much. If you give me the floor as a teacher, I can go on until, I don't know. Thank you very much for everything, for being here, and for all your friendship and warm words. Thank you.